Hi everyone, welcome to part 2 of the video where we will dive into the rest of the legislative changes to the NDIA Act. We already covered the sections on the screen in part 1 of the video. Make sure to go back and watch it if you haven't done already. It is so crucial to be in the know and up to date with what is happening in the NDIS, as of course it has significant effect on everyone who is part of this sector. And these are the following sections that I will cover in today's part 2 of the video. So let's jump in. Definition of NDIS supports, section 10. This temporary rule is in place until July 2025, at which point the final definitions will be confirmed. Essentially, the legislation now divides supports into two categories: NDIS supports, which are eligible for funding, and non-NDIS supports, which are not eligible. Previously, the distinction was murky, especially for items or services straddling the line between disability-related and everyday living expenses. These amendments aim to remove that ambiguity and ensure NDIS funds are spent on supports directly tied to participants' impairments. The new rules also introduce the concept of replacement supports. These are typically alternative or non-evidence-based supports that aren't usually eligible for funding, but may be approved under specific circumstances. The way the replacement supports work is exactly what it sounds like. They aimed at replacing an existing or already approved NDIS support in the participant's plan with a non-NDIS support. Previously, the NDIS lacked clear definitions of what could be funded, leading to significant gray areas that, unfortunately, allowed for some exploitations by both providers and participants. Now, the government is addressing these vulnerabilities by defining which services qualify as NDIS-funded supports, focusing on those that are evidence-based. Supports that don't meet this standard are classified as non-NDIS supports, and participants who need alternative options can apply for replacement supports if necessary. These lists of supports didn't appear out of nowhere. Between August 4th and August 25th of this year, the government sought feedback from participants, providers, and other stakeholders. The consultations received over 6,000 survey responses, nearly 1,000 emails, and 120 submissions from organizations and peak bodies. Given there are over 661,000 participants in the scheme, some argue this is a modest response. Moving forward, the NDIA has committed to improving accessibility during consultations by providing materials in formats like Easy Read, Ausland, and languages other than English. Approved NDIS support lists. These are supports that NDIS typically funds, which are directly related to participants' impairment and essential for their daily functioning, independence, or improved quality of life. Examples include things like therapeutic supports, services like speech therapy, occupational therapy, or physiotherapy, assistive technology, mobility aids like wheelchairs, hearing aids, and communication devices, home modifications, and personal care. It's worth noting that just because a specific piece of assistive technology isn't on the list doesn't automatically exclude it from NDIS supports. As the NDIA has stated, the scope of assistive technology is broad and many items may still qualify as NDIS supports, so the participants are asked to send in their requests. Non-NDIS support lists. On the flip side, there are 15 categories of supports that NDIS will no longer fund because they are either considered the responsibility of other sectors like health or education, or they lack a direct disability-related focus or are not evidence-based. Examples include general medical and health services like hospital treatments, primary health care, and medications, education-related costs like school fees, tutoring, social and recreation outings without a disability focus like general leisure activities or going to the cinema. And if you're wondering, sex therapy or any type of sexual service will not be funded under the new legislative changes, as well as alcohol or drugs. Interestingly, in a recent interview on the Sama Foundation's YouTube channel, NDIA CEO clarified that while sex services are excluded, adaptive sexual equipment can still be funded if it's considered necessary. Side note, if you haven't checked out that podcast hosted by Dr. George, it's worth a listen, and I will include a link in the description below. Supports that move to non-NDIS status include alternative therapies with no evidence base. Certain therapies that lack sufficient evidence of effectiveness for disabilities are now excluded from NDIS funding. The replacement list includes supports that are specifically excluded from being funded by the NDIS. There are typically alternative therapies or non-conventional treatments with limited, no proven benefit for disability management, especially if they are deemed not reasonable and necessary. Apart from meeting the reasonable and necessary criteria, a replacement support must also meet the following criteria. They must replace an existing NDIS support in the participant plan, they must provide the same or better benefit as the original support, and they also must cost the same or less than the original support that is approved in the participant's plan. Example of replacement supports include alternative and complementary therapies such as forest therapy, myotherapy, and maybe remedial massage. Another example is recreational, hobbyist, or luxury goods. Items that are basically not essential to the person's disability or impairment, such as gaming consoles or non-adaptive fitness equipment, are also excluded, unless they serve a therapeutic purpose. So which groups are mostly affected? These changes will mostly impact participants with disabilities that are often managed through alternative or holistic treatments. For instance, individuals with sensory disabilities who may have previously accessed certain alternative therapies for sensory processing, participants with complex psychosocial disabilities. Some alternative therapies were used by individuals with anxiety or mental health conditions, which now need to be replaced by evidence-based interventions. This also will impact chronic pain or neurological disorders. Participants managing those will need to shift to approved therapies like physiotherapy or approved pain management techniques. One final but crucial point about these transitional rules regarding NDIS supports. Will the NDIA raise a debt against participants who claim non-NDIS supports? To answer this, let's refer to the interview between Dr. George and NDIS CEO on the Summer Foundation YouTube channel. The NDIA CEO assures that there will be plenty of opportunities for participants who unintentionally claim for non-NDIS supports to work with the NDIA. The focus will be on education about the changes, with raising a debt being an absolute last resort. If the NDIA ever decides to pursue a debt, the CEO personally has to sign on that decision. This ensures that the raising a debt is the absolute last resort and that every case is carefully considered at the highest level. In practical terms, this means that if a participant accidentally uses their funding on a non-NDIS support costing less than $1,500 up until October next year, they won't face immediate consequences, but may receive up to 2 warnings from NDIA. Again, the NDIA CEO also made it clear that intentional and repeated spending on non-NDIS supports is a different matter. In such cases, the NDIA may consider using tools outlined in the recent legislation, such as switching the participant's plan management type. If the behavior continues despite these measures, the NDIA may ultimately pursue more serious action, including raising a debt. So what's the key takeaway? Mistakes are okay, but learning and adapting to these new rules is essential to avoid complications. So what does this mean for the providers? Providers were given 30 days to comply to the recent legislation changes, as the NDIA has the authority to raise debts against those who acquire or provide supports that are not classified as NDIS supports or do not comply with a participant's plan, especially if the NDIA has paid for these services. To avoid such issues, providers are advised to familiarize themselves with the updated lists of approved and non-approved NDIS supports. Inclusion of total funding amounts and periods in plans. Section 33. Plans approved after the legislation's commencement will specify total funding amounts, funding component amounts, and funding periods. This change provides clarity on available funds and their intended duration. This update is also significant because it adds a layer of control over spending, ensuring participants can better manage their budgets throughout the plan's duration. It addresses the issue of participants exhausting funds prematurely, which could otherwise lead to unpaid provider invoices or lapses in essential supports before a new plan begins. Additionally, the amendment strengthens the NDIA's oversight, allowing it to intervene by changing plan management if it identifies signs of funding mismanagement. However, this structured approach to funding periods may not work as well for everyone. For participants with fluctuating conditions, this setup could actually create more challenges. If their conditions suddenly worsens and they require additional supports or funding within the allocated period, they may find themselves in a tough spot with insufficient resources until the next funding cycle kicks in. This could force participants to navigate difficult conversations with the NDIA to justify urgent funding adjustments or risk going without essential supports. For people with fluctuating needs, this rigidity may feel less like financial security and more like a constraint that fails to recognize the unpredictable nature of their condition. While the amendment aims to create transparency and control, it's crucial that the system remains flexible enough to accommodate those who need more dynamic support planning. Compared to the original 2013 NDIS Act, this is a significant shift prior to which plans didn't need to spell out funding in this much detail. Again, NDIA is able to change the plan management if they believe there is funding mismanagement. Plan variations, Section 47A. The section is addressing plan variations for the new plans completed after 3rd of October. Although we were already able to apply for plan variations prior to the legislation, NDIA is advising that even the introduction of funding amounts and funding periods can now be varied through this process. However, the process remains subject to the NDIA's discretion, meaning participants must provide sufficient evidence to justify any requested variation. Information gathering for participant status revocation, Section 30. The NDIA can request specific information or require participants to undertake certain actions, such as an assessment, when considering revoking participant status. Non-compliance within a reasonable time frame may lead to revoked participants' access to NDIS. This section is distinct from the 2013 Act, which lacked specific provisions for systematically requesting information or requiring participants to take actions, such as undergoing an assessment, before revoking their access. The amendment outlines a clear timeline requiring a participant to provide the requested information within 90 days, with the possibility of extensions in certain circumstances. Now, if a participant's status is revoked and they seek a review of that decision, they cannot make another access request to the scheme until the review is complete. If the review confirms the revocation, the individual must wait 12 months before submitting a new access request. Previously to the change, the person was allowed for immediate reapplication to access NDIS following a review confirming revocation. The amended legislation imposes a 12-month waiting period after a confirmed revocation, adding a wait time to reaccessing the NDIS. Eligibility Reassessments, Section 30A. The new Section 30A introduces provisions for eligibility reassessments, outlining circumstances where certain groups may be required to undergo a review of their NDIS eligibility. This is a key change from the original Act, which did not explicitly address ongoing assessments for participants after their initial access was granted. The original Act primarily focused on the initial assessment of eligibility, with little mention of systematic or mandatory reassessments after a participant entered the scheme. While the participants could voluntarily request changes to their plans and the NDIA could review plans in certain circumstances, there was no explicit requirement for eligibility assessments tied to specific milestones or situation changes. Under the new amendments, eligibility reassessments can be triggered by specific milestones or changes, such as when children reach a certain age, like turning 9, and transitioning out of the early intervention stream. The NDIS focus, it seems, to be on ensuring that eligibility remains consistent with the scheme's objectives, particularly as participants' needs or circumstances change over time. While this adds a layer of accountability to the system, it also places additional demands on participants and their families, who most likely will require to provide updated evidence or navigate a reassessment process. Claims and Payments Framework, Section 45A. The new Section 45A of the NDIS Act introduces a significant change by establishing a 2-year time limit for making claims. Self-managed participants and providers must now submit claims within the 2 years of receiving or delivering the support. This is a notable departure from the original 2013 Act, which did not impose a strict timeframe for submitting claims. The section protects the NDIA from managing delayed and retroactive claims, which could complicate budget forecasting and fund allocation. However, this change could pose challenges for self-management participants or providers who may struggle with record keeping or timely submissions due to complex needs or administrative hurdles. The positive side is this change will undeniably bring greater financial oversight within the scheme, preventing potential misuse of the funding. Support Needs Assessment, Section 32L. The introduction of Section 32L marks a shift from the original NDIS Act, which did not mandate a formalized support needs assessment as part of the planning process. The new section introduces a structured framework where participants will undergo an assessment to document their comprehensive whole-of-a-person disability support needs. Unlike the original Act, which focused on eligibility and planning based on a functional assessment or any other participant-provided information, this amendment creates a more systematic approach to identifying and recording needs. However, the implementation of this assessment has not yet been confirmed, leaving questions about how it will be integrated into the broader planning process. The practical application of this section, however, will also depend heavily on how the NDIA implements and enforces this requirement. Without clear implementation guidelines, there is a risk of delays or inconsistencies that could impact participants. New Planning Framework, Section 32K. The introduction of the new planning framework represents a notable shift from the original 2013 Act, though its specifics remain largely undefined. According to the NDIA website, the new framework will introduce a flexible budget determined using a support needs assessment. This marks a departure from the more rigid funding structure under the 2013 Act, which allocated funding without standardized method for tailoring budget to dynamic or individualized support needs. While this sounds promising in theory, offering the potential for budgets to be more adaptive to a participant's actual requirements, there are still significant gaps in understanding how this will be implemented. For example, questions remain about how these needs assessments will be conducted, whether they will account for fluctuating or evolving conditions, and how quickly adjustments can be made. So the implementation for this rule is yet to be confirmed. If you're still with me, wow, I admire your patience. It was quite a lot to digest. Alright, so that's a comprehensive look at the recent changes to the NDIS Act and how they compare to the original 2013 framework. While the updates aim to create more clarity, accountability, and alignment with participants' actual needs, it's clear this is already causing significant challenges to navigating the new legislation, and here is why. The tightening of the rules around what constitutes NDIS supports versus non-NDIS supports has created a lot of confusion in this sector. The plan managers are now caught in the middle, tasked with enforcing these new rules, while participant and service providers struggle to understand why their services are no longer covered. In many cases, supports that have been previously approved informally by the NDIA, whether through verbal agreement or past approvals that were not clearly documented, are now being rejected by plan managers based on the new legislative change. The shift has been especially problematic because many participants and providers have been operating under the assumption that these supports were guaranteed as part of the participant's plan, with no foreshadowing of what's really about to come. Participants are now facing severe disruptions as their regular supports may suddenly be deemed ineligible for NDIS funding. Many are being told to source these services through other means, like using personal funds or finding other local services or government schemes, which can cause a lot of stress, especially where a participant does not have the financial means to alternative supports that they can rely on. For providers, this shift is causing payment delays and rejected invoices. Many service providers are experiencing a cash flow crunch as plan managers reject payments for services that were previously approved. This is particularly challenging for providers who rely on timely payments to keep their businesses running, and many are now faced with closing their business because of these changes. Some providers have also found themselves in disputes with NDIA and plan managers over what constitutes NDIS-funded support versus replacement or mainstream supports. Of course, there are contradictions near and far with NDIA. The general consensus in online community groups is just keep calling NDIA enough times until you receive an answer you are after. Great. Support coordinators are also finding themselves in difficult positions, having to explain to participants that have been receiving supports for years why they no longer qualify for these supports, while also helping them transition to new funding sources or alternative supports. And in most cases, this is not even possible. The government is now truly clamping down on the spending and the misuse of the NDIS funding overall. While they have acknowledged a need for foundational supports outside of NDIS, where people with mild disabilities or ones that don't qualify for NDIS can turn to, nothing really has been done so far apart from talking about it, making recommendations, whilst the cost cutting within NDIS has already begun. So here's my small piece of information that I promised earlier that may save you a bit of time with your admin. If you're still using old NDA consent forms, I am referring to consent for a third party to act on behalf of a participant and consent for the NDIA to share your information. The NDIA has now started to phase out and deny them. It's time to switch to the updated version, which was released in July 2024. Using the correct form could save you from unnecessary delays, and I have included a link to this from the NDIS website in the video's description below. As we navigate these changes, one thing is certain: staying informed and proactive will be key. If you're a participant or a provider, take the time to understand how these updates might affect your plans, supports, or funding. And don't hesitate to reach out for advice or guidance if you need help. If you found this breakdown useful, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe, and share it with anyone who might benefit from understanding these changes. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear how these changes are impacting you or your work. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time with more NDIS updates and insights.